My first introduction to James was when I was a doctoral student at UCLA, and somewhat in the closet. This was maybe 1968. 1 foot out, 1 foot in, and a fellow graduate student said, "There are these experimental films that are going to be shown Friday and Saturday night, and I think you'd like them." And the person that created them, I think he's a gay man. I'm not sure, but I think he is. The words they used to describe him, telegraph gay man. You know, back in the 60s, there were certain kinds of words that if the newspaper used them, there was a good chance that they were saying he's a faggot, but didn't say it out loud. There's a lot of man-centered imagery in these films. There's some nudity of largely men. I thought, oh, this is someplace I need to be. So I went to see these films, and I was blown away by them. It was what was called experimental films in those days. I think a better word to use would have been independent films. People made them on their own. Put a lot of love and creativity and time into them, expense into them. And I saw these films Friday night, and I went back a second time Saturday night because I wanted to see them again because the imagery in the films were so powerful to me. And to this day, there's some of those images that I carry with me, 40 years later. So it was, they were that kind of films to me. There's one image of somebody, a man, and the wind is blowing, and there's just a tree there, and somehow this white shroud is blowing, black and white, and I just stayed with me that way. And the person who was showing the films was a gay man by the name of Bill Moritz. I don't know if you know Bill, but he taught at Cal Arts and was a central person in the I guess what's now called visual music field. And Bill was showing the films. And so I met both Bill and James that evening. I was very shy at the time, so, I admired him from a distance, James, and I don't think he ever knew that I was there. What has stayed with me over the years around the films, in addition to the images, was what I thought James was trying to do. Today we make, with visual music, or some people make a big thing out of music and images working together. And I was thinking today, well, that's trying to keep 2 balls in the air. James tried to keep 3 balls, at least 3 balls in the air, with the music, with the images, and then with the poetry. With the words that were spoken. And so it's like visual music poetry or something like that he was trying to do. And I'd never been exposed to anything like that. And it just blew me away. This was the late 60s, so it wasn't the quiet, it wasn't like the late 50s. This is the late 60s, and it blew me away with the imagery and what James was trying to do. Thereafter, I kind of lost contact with his filmmaking because a revolution was taking place in this country, and particularly for gay people, and reconnected with James again through his poetry in probably the early 70s, mid-70s again. So the question, how did you meet James? That was it, through one of his films. James has been basically the same way I experience him as the same person. An effervescent, running over the top of the cup, gay man, a little distracted, having the ability to listen deeply, someone you just wanted to hug. Of course, I never did in those days, but that's how I experienced. And the last time I saw James, which was probably at a reading here, maybe early 80s, mid 80s, same way. Much more open though. I mean, much less guarded, as all of us are as we get older, and the Pope no longer runs our lives. Well, let me say why it's important to me, and then maybe the ripples will go out from there. As a gay man who came of age in the 60s, late 60s, and 70s with gay liberation, One of the things I always felt an absence in my life was elders. There were older gay men that were involved with the movement. I was maybe 28 when I got started. And there were older men who were involved with the movement, but I never saw them as elders. Many times they might be 40 or 50 years old, 20 years older than me, and I saw them more as peers, boys who hadn't grown up yet. And James was important to me because he came across as my grandfather. He came across as somebody important. He came across as somebody worth listening to. And many times when he would come visit us at the Radical Faeries sanctuary here in Los Angeles, I experienced or envisioned it as a visit of my grandfather. And because that was so missing in my life. Even though I had teachers and mentors and elders in my life, there was still this great longing for more and more and more. And James filled that for me. He was a gay man who was openly gay, at least in the periods that I knew him, who was creative, lived with that flame burning at all times within him, could listen more than many times give advice. The ceremony that he wrote about his Joel Singer and his marriage union ceremony was one of the first times that I saw somebody, particularly a gay person, actualizing the idea of bringing spirit and relationship and what I assumed was a sexual relationship together in one person. Very rarely in the early 70s did I ever see that. There was a lot of theorizing and talking about such things, but to actually see somebody implement something, create a sacred space where that union could occur, seems very important to me. He never lost his sense of humor. I've seen him in very tense situations, and there was always that sparkle in his eye. He was always ready to do another Betty Davis imitation, making everybody laugh. They usually happen at the Radical Faeries sanctuary here in Los Angeles, when maybe Harry Hay would get into a discussion with somebody, and Harry had the would have been perfect for that Charlton Heston role of going up to the mountaintop and coming back with the 10 Commandments. And somebody had an 11th commandment, and Harry let them know that there were only 10 commandments. And at that moment, James could intercede with a quip, with a rolling of the eyeballs, with something that would just kind of let the tension out of the room, and we could get on with the merriment. I was both. I understood that, and you couldn't see his films, you couldn't read his poetry, you couldn't come in contact with him without knowing that. It was so clear that he had a depth psychological experience. That this was not the cookie cutter experience that most people have. This was something that had some depth to it, as James had depth to it. I didn't experience James as a message primarily. I experienced him more as a presence. I experienced him more as somebody who was really living being gay in a new way, without preaching, without the missionary zeal, without the need to convert anybody. He did it basically through just being who he was. He was somebody, at least for me, that I could say, oh, this is somebody I want to be like when I grow up. Maybe if there's a message to that, it's probably authenticity, being real, sharing the fruits of your labor with other people, but you don't have to share all the labor with them. Well, he comes out of San Francisco, so that's not an easy theological question. San Francisco is a city where many roads meet. East, west, north, south, inner, outer, edge of the village, center of the village. So it depends where you're positioned in San Francisco, as in most towns. What was his spiritual path? I could see him easily as a Sufi, being in lineage with somebody like Rumi or Hafiz in the poetry that he was writing. I could see him as a village idiot, in the sense of the old shaman who lived at the edge of the village, doing his shamanic work with people, on people. I could see him very easily in that role. I don't see him as a Presbyterian. Vaguely, marginally. I never got into that where we discussed that relationship. But I was aware that he was part of that San Francisco cauldron of spiritual, intellectual, physical, sexual, alcoholic, drug-induced ecstasy. You know, there's something about the generation that James belonged to that I always admired as an adult looking at that generation and what they accomplished, and as someone who's been actively involved in gay community organizing since Stonewall, that there's something they carried that just couldn't be destroyed, even though they tried, that the homophobic society around just could not touch. And there's something around people like James Broughton, Malcolm Boyd, Harry Hay, Morris Kite here in Los Angeles, who I worked with closely, Merce Cunningham, John Cage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, where they were who they were. They didn't have to make a big deal out of it, but you knew very clearly that they were gay men, and they were people of substance. And I always appreciated that. I had an opportunity not too long ago to hear an interview that Merce Cunningham did with somebody, and they said, "But you're gay. How comes you haven't come out publicly? Everybody knows you're gay, but you never talk about it." And Merce said, "Well, I do talk about it. Somebody asked me, 'What's your life like with John?' And I told them, 'I cook the meals and John washes the dishes.'" And I just love that, the idea of Merce Cunningham cooking and John Cage with his hands in the sudsy dishwater washing the dishes. But there's something about that generation that just appeals to me a lot. And it's not assimilationist. I'm not talking about an assimilationist position. It's something where they're so secure in who they are, or secure enough in who they are, that they can move from that place of inner authority without having to bother too much about what the others are thinking. James kind of reminds me as the brother of Alan Watts. They were separated at birth, but you can tell they come from the same parents. And you know, he was open, free, exploratory, supportive, few judgments, interested, physically in this world with spirit. Not like me, where I spent the first maybe 30 years of my life with 3 or 4 different parts of me in different rooms. All of him was together at one place in one room. I consider him a sexual liberationist. Not in the sense of let's go to the bathhouse and put on disco music, take drugs and fuck all night. Not in that sense. But more in a sense where spirit and sexual energy come together in a way that many times you'll encounter in Tantra, or certain Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist or Indian Hindu practices, where there's an understanding that the throat chakra of inspiration and creativity is connected to the genital areas, the second chakra. There's a road between those two, and it involves generativity in the broadest sense of the word. And James seemed like he knew that. If he didn't know it, he certainly lived his life as if he knew it. I think probably the closest I've ever come to that in understanding is out of the Hindu tradition, where they have a word, Atman, which refers to the indwelling God. There's Brahman, which is the big daddy out there. But internally, there's a part of him, Brahman, that's in me called Atman. And that I carry God with me. And so that as I move in the world and as I do certain things mindfully, that part is always present with me. God isn't a Burl Ives-looking figure living up there on a cloud somewhere, but he's an indwelling spirit within me. Very Gnostic in many ways in terms of how James moved in the world with that God-body understanding. Except the Gnostics are always fighting. Those parts are fighting against themselves. Where in James, it seemed like there was a peaceful coexistence. For me, James always carried the archetype of the radical fairy for me. That was the archetype. While Harry Hay and I spent a lot of time organizing the first gathering and continuing keeping things going, and many other people look upon Harry Hay as the archetype of the radical fairy, I always saw James as that person. Self-effacing, going about his work in the village, doing what he had to do, sharing his beauty and creativity with other people, not being too hung up on positive reviews, although that's always nice to get. Being able to dance in the moonlight. I always had the feeling with Harry that he would be a little bit too uptight, like I would be, of taking off my clothing and dancing in the moonlight. I think with James, that would not have been a problem. So when I think of the archetype of the radical fairy externally, James Broughton is a person I always go to. There's something pixie-ish about it. There's something that, in Ireland they have there's a warning that parents have, are told about. They said you have to be careful about watching your children at night. Because if they hear the fairy music, they'll want to crawl out the window and go and be with the fairies and dance in the moonlight with them, sing with them, and you might not get them back. James always seemed like that kind of subversive fairy. He was the person that once you danced with him or once you heard the music, it was hard to go back to mommy and daddy's house again. He was revolutionary, actually, in the way that he moved in the world. Not in the terms of the manifestos he issued, but more in the way that he lived his life and the way that he provided a model for us as gay men to maybe consider as a path that's worth walking. It's hard for me to describe somebody else's journey. What I generally do is I love listening to people talking about their journey. I think the big turning point for him was separating from his wife. That separation was the turning point for him. And many times, in a broader context, an important turning point in all of our lives, and I thank Carl Jung for this understanding, is at midlife, is at age 40 symbolically. However you define midlife, and it's not necessarily chronological, where all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, gradually, but where there comes a time when the price you pay for living an inauthentic life, the price you pay for living a life of the false self, giving to the world a persona that's not real. There comes a time when you have to take off the mask. Malcolm Boyd wrote one of his books about his coming out was Take Off the Mask. It's that idea that someplace the price we pay for living that life is too high. It's destroying us. And in many different ways, we free ourselves from that prison. And I think that was a major creative turning point for James that allowed him to go deeper in terms of listening to himself. Earlier, I used the word inner authority. I think up until that time, from things that he's told me and things that I've read about James, he was a good boy. Maybe Mama's a good boy. And external authority was important in his life. And there came a point where he was no longer willing to pay that price. And he ended a marriage. He moved in a different direction. And I think it's like his life being spared, like somebody absolving him of something or pardoning him or something, and allowed him to live his life again. And whenever you have a near-death experience, and that's what those lives in the closet are, near-death experience. Every time you have that, and you realize you're not going to die, there's an energy that flows through you that this time I'm going to use it much better. And I think James's life is a good example of that. I'm not trying to imply that before this turning point in his life, he wasn't creative, because he was. He was creative as a 6-year-old. You couldn't take that out of him. But in terms of deepening his journey, deepening his creativity, listening to voices maybe that he hadn't listened to before internally, that happened after he left the marriage, found Joel, and life unfolded in a different direction. Well, I always move from the place that death ends a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. So it doesn't feel to me as if I've lost James. I'll pick up his poetry. I'll be talking to somebody and I'll say, oh, wait a minute. James Broughton wrote a poem about this. And I go scurrying through my books, opening up. Oh, here it is. You got it? So it's not like he's not here. James has moved from elder to ancestor. And in that ancestral role, it isn't as if the ancestors aren't here with us. They are here with us, sometimes on a daily basis. And when we need them, when we need to access their wisdom, they're available to us. So the idea of death, he's gone from me, it doesn't compute for me. I still have an alive relationship with him. For example, I have a more alive relationship with my father since my 40s than I ever had with him while he was here on this plane. The discussions I have with him, the understandings that I get, the remembrances of things that he said to me at certain points are more alive today than when I was 16. Tidings to Stan Brakhage, written in 1965. Where were you in 1965? I Asked the Sea, it's called. I asked the sea. I asked the sea how deep things are. Oh, said she, that depends about how far you want to go. Well, I have a sea in me, said I. Do you have a me in you? Oh, here we go. I'll look, said the sea, but that's apt to go rather deep. And she broke a wave over my foot. Why are you so restless? Said I to the sea. I'm calmer than you, said she. This sounds like something out of Alice in Wonderland. The wind and the moon like to toss me about by myself. I do nothing at all. I accept whatever comes, and everything comes to me. How do you manage that, said I. Well, that's a good question. And she replied, oh, she replied, I have rather a good digestion. The whimsy in him, the playfulness in him, the fairy in him is truly a delight whenever I read his stuff. One of the lines of poetry that I read in one of his poems, this might have been, who knows when, Mark Thompson was in the habit of when a new book would come out by James, he would buy a copy for me and slip it unannounced into my lunch bag to feed me during my lunch break, both literally and spiritually. But some decades ago, who knows when, I read a line of James's where he said, I live my life by the great cliches. That caught my attention. Because, as an uppity 18, 19-year-old in college, I always made fun and put down people who spoke in platitudes, cliches, what have you, like our presidents. And all of a sudden, I live my life by the great cliches. What did he mean by that? Was he being funny? So kind of like John Cage writing one of these symphonies, a new movement every 10 years. I kind of, maybe 10 years or so, contemplated that. Every now and then I think, I wonder what he means by that. Oh, he's just being funny. You know James. He's making... And then by the second decade, I began thinking, I don't, maybe he's not making fun. Maybe he's really serious. And as I got older, I began to understand, at least for myself, that when you don't understand you're talking in cliches, there's a problem. Because you're not saying anything. But when you know about cliches, when you see how cliches are used, you don't want to imitate that. But in every cliche, in every platitude, in every aphorism, there is a kernel of deep wisdom if you pay attention to it. And I think that's what James was talking about. Like with the sea going deep. He was kind of like, I don't know, E.E. Cummings. He was beyond punctuation and capital letters. Not because he didn't know how to do it, but that wasn't what he was doing. And the same with James. It was like those cliches really did guide his life, but not in the way they guided most people. He understood the wisdom many times contained in them. It's kind of, most people deal with the outer shell of the fortune cookie. James had, metaphorically, the courage and wisdom to break it open and actually read what was inside. And so his poetry obviously speaks to me. The way Whitman's poetry speaks to me. The way Ginsberg's poetry speaks to me. In many ways, he was as visionary as they were. But where Whitman alludes to the pleasures of the flesh, and sometimes makes us believe that he was getting it, and there's some debate about whether it was imaginary or real, but it doesn't really matter. James was somebody who lived it. I see him in that tradition of Blake, Whitman, Ginsberg, the visionary tradition that gay men are often found a part of. If they were present, I never heard them. People knew better than to share them with me. No, I never heard them. I think mostly I would hear James's poetry read in circles of gay men. Either he would be doing a reading at Different Light bookstore here in Los Angeles, or he would be doing a reading at some fairy event. And I think it was using Harry's metaphor of subject-subject consciousness. I think it was a subject-subject consciousness experience where it was same listening to the same and got it. That's an interesting question. I would wonder how straight people would react to that poetry. We know from Blake and Whitman and Ginsberg that straight men, straight women, react to it many times in the same way we do, or in ways that also move them. I was, when is this, maybe 1969, 70? I was at a bunch of us from the Gay Liberation Front here in Los Angeles. I drove up to Sacramento where Ginsberg was giving a poetry reading. The gym was packed. It was literally standing room only. And there was Alan sitting in the middle on a little blanket with his harmonium, just Alan and his harmonium, singing his poetry. And at one point he said, I need a male volunteer to help me with this next poem. And hands went up, and Alan picked the cutest, youngest gay man, I don't know if he's gay or not, and he came, and Alan said, I'd like you to sit in front of me so I can keep you in my gaze. And then he read his poem, Fuck Me, which consists of the words, fuck me. But as Alan said it, it wasn't just fuck me over and over again. Each one of those times he said it had a different intonation. It was a different place in the dance that Alan was speaking from. I would speculate that was a young straight man sitting in front of him. He handled it beautifully, and when it was over, he went over and kissed Alan on the cheek. There is some place where I think this gay visionary poetry is heard by a much larger audience. And I would include James in that. That's pretty much how he was moving in the world. There comes a time, and I'm 70 right now, and so I'm an old man right now. But there came a time in my life, and it wasn't as I hoped in my 20s or 30s or 40s, but sometime after 50, there came a time when, I just, the issues around mommy and daddy just weren't important anymore. They did not occupy. The issues around that I'm gay or not, the issue that I come from a working class family, the issue of privileged people and their privilege, and blah, blah, blah. And there came a point where I felt, and I'm still feeling, a peacefulness. I would say for me, it's the great contentment. For James, it was the great joy. But I think we're probably sitting next to each other in the forest, that those patches are close to each other. There comes a time as an old person where much of this material does integrate, where much of the alchemical process does produce a version of, more than a 99-cent store version of the Philosopher's Stone. And when hearing that statement around James, I think it's true for him, that there's some place where he moved in the world with joy. As I said, it was primarily his poetry which reached me. I'm more of a person of the word than I am a person of the image. Although images are important to me, they're more self-generated images rather than commercialized images hitting me. Not that James's films were commercialized, just the opposite. But films is not a medium that speaks to me greatly. As I mentioned, my first introduction to James was through his films. As I said, I marveled at them. It's called The Song of the Bed, and there's no clue here when it was written, but I have been informed from a good source that it was written after the film The Bed. Oh, everything important in life occurs upon a bed. It's where you cry when you're born and where you lie when dead. You spend a third of your life in bed with sickness, sex, and sleeping. You can have a good laugh with your love in bed, though it's also used for weeping. Yes, indeed. It's in a bed most fantastic things are hoped for and conceived. It's where you dream. It's where you scheme. It's where you are deceived. It's where on earth you come to birth. It's where on earth you come to birth. And most of childhood spent. It's where you come and where you don't. And where you come to an end. The Song of the Bed by James Broughton. So true. So true. I always used to marvel when I was younger and was not living a life of involuntary celibacy, that many times having a little bit too much wine to drink at a party or someplace, and many times the man I went to bed with at night was not the same man I woke up with in the morning after the alcohol wore off. The bed is truly a marvelous place. It was said during World War II, Prime Minister Winston Churchill many times would disappear. And he would be gone for 2 or 3 hours at a time, where people did not know where he was at. And they finally would find him in bed sleeping. And I always liked that. Some people say, well, he was a depressive, blah, blah, blah. It might have been. I think it was much more. It was a place where it renewed him. It does certainly me. If I'm confused about something, upset about something, I head to my bed, pull the covers up over myself, and let something else incubate me for a little while, and I wake up and I'm renewed and ready to go. You know, in James and Joel's relationship, it was a real pleasure just to see them in a room, to experience them together. Not that there weren't rough patches now and then that they had to skate over or something else, but you could see by the way they treated each other that they truly cared for each other, that their connection was a deep one. They loved each other deeply. It was a subject-subject relationship. They fed each other in ways that could be imagined and maybe unimagined. It was a wonderful relationship to see. The few times I was around them for an extended period of time. Like they would come to Los Angeles or something, and they would stay with us at the Radical Faeries sanctuary where Harry Hay, John Burnside, I, and Michael Fleming lived. And I'd be around them for 2 or 3 days. It was very obvious that they deeply loved each other, cared for each other, looked out for each other in wonderful ways. The way Harry Hay talks about it, and I think he's right, Whitman talked about it the same way. That Whitman talked in his poetry that there are 2 types of consciousness. There is amative consciousness, which some people associate with heterosexuals or people in that part of the forest. And then there was something that he called adhesive consciousness, which dealt with another kind of consciousness that some people carry. Whitman himself never went to the extent of explaining it further than that. But those scholars of Whitman's poetry who study this find those 2 words throughout his poetry used in the context of a certain kind of consciousness. I think Harry, when he talks about one of the things that differentiates gay men from heterosexual men is the consciousness we carry. That heterosexual men or heterosexuals generally carry a subject-object consciousness. It's me and you are different than me, subject-object. And that consciousness shapes much of heterosexual relationships. Where gay men carry a more subject-subject consciousness. It's same union and consciousness. That men are not these strange creatures that we don't know, but that men, or particularly gay men, other gay men, are a part of a tribe that we know about. And so when we talk about certain things, we understand it in a way that maybe we don't with our heterosexual friends. It's what Harry meant by subject-subject consciousness. One of the ways in which we as gay men probably are different than our beloved heterosexual brothers and sisters. I'm a Jungian psychologist here in Los Angeles, working largely with gay men, but not entirely with gay men. And I work with people out of my home, out of my living room, where one whole wall is a bookshelf. And many times when I'm working with a patient, there will be a dream image. There will be something they'll say. There's something that I hear in an echo or between words, and I say, oh, that reminds me of a James Broughton poem. And I scurry to my bookcase and spend 10 minutes trying to find the poem, locating it, and then reading it to them, and maybe allowing them to take the book of poetry home with them and bring them back next week. That there's a way that what James is tapping into, I think, is the collective gay unconscious, the collective unconsciousness, period. And then there's a room in that collective unconscious marked gay men. And he is connected with that in some way. One of the things that I studied when I was at UCLA, I was getting a doctorate in African and Islamic history, and was also interested in linguistics and was studying Semitic languages. One of the things I learned was the levels of meaning in a word, which makes the poetic tradition in Semitic languages just a delight, because there's so many different levels of understanding the words that are being used. And James's poetry reminds me a little bit of that. When the poem where he was having a dialogue with the sea, and she says, well, you have to go deep for that. And I had the sense that he was willing to do that, to go deep. And his poetry reflects that. And so sometimes people will read his poetry at a certain level and laugh and get something from it. And other people will read it and they're next to tears, in terms of reading something which reflects their own experience, or reflects an image which they had in a dream, or reflects something synchronistically like that. That's one of the ways that I use it. I also, for the last 25, 30 years here in Los Angeles, anytime I do anything public, and sometimes privately, but do anything in the gay community, I've gotten into the habit of creating sacred space. And I say to people, and this is something that you're probably not used to. Our ancestors did it all the time. But there's the understanding that when you're talking about or dealing with something of great importance, you don't do that in ordinary space. You create extraordinary space, sacred space, in order to do that. And so there's always a little ritual, simple. One of the things I do in creating that sacred space is having somebody read what I call an ancestor voice, bringing the ancestors into the room. And it's usually between Whitman, Ginsberg, and James Broughton that I select a poem. Mary Oliver recently, where I select a poem that represents the ancestor's voice coming into the room. And so I use James's poetry in that way. It might depend on what we're doing. What the gathering is about, that would depend on the poem I select. Or to tell the truth, most often the poem selects me. It tells me which one to be read. But that's some of the ways that I use James's poetry. That's why I said earlier, death ends a life, it doesn't end a relationship. James is as alive in my life today as he was when he was walking this earth. Jung often said that a therapist can only take a patient as deep as the therapist himself or herself has gone. And I think there's truth to that. That the level at which we dialogue with somebody many times reflects the depth to which we've gone in our own lives. And I think James is one of those people that when he was involved in Jungian analysis, when and afterwards, that always kept it going a little bit. What's around that corner? What's around that corner? I could hear him saying. That he kept going down there. And when you go down to the bottom of the ocean, you find wondrous things that you never knew existed. But you have to be willing and courageous enough to go down there. Or stupid enough. That's why I said James is a good village idiot. He's stupid enough to allow himself to go down into those depths. It reminds me of a public television program several years ago that they were doing on octopi and octopuses and that family of sea creatures. And they were looking at the flora and fauna around ocean volcanoes. There are eruptions in the ocean, and flora and fauna develop around these volcanoes, and they were looking at them deep, deep, deep in the ocean. They had to use a bathysphere to go down there. And for the first time ever, they captured on film two octopi, having sex. And the scientists were very excited by this. Never before had this been seen because they're out of sight. It's not like you can recreate this in the laboratory and then film it. And they sent the film off to one of the leading researchers on octopuses. And she wrote back saying, well, these were not heterosexual octopuses. These were two males having sex down there at the bottom of the ocean. So even down there in the depths, we'll find this queer life still going on. And James was like that. He could see the queer life no matter what level of the ocean he was working in. And I think it's one of his gifts that he was a seer. He could see things that many times other people would miss. Little things, like the poem about the bed. He could have a relationship with, he could see things about the bed that most of us don't see or don't stop enough or aren't quiet enough or haven't gone deep enough to be able to see. Probably about 1981, more or less, probably more. And James and Joel had come to Los Angeles for the weekend. There was something James had to do. And we invited them to stay at the Radical Faeries sanctuary where we all lived together, where Harry Hay, John Burnside, and Michael Fleming and I lived together. And there was something where James was very helpful to me that day, very helpful. And I'm eternally grateful for his help with this. Harry Hay and I played a central role in creating and founding and getting started the Radical Faerie movement, which has developed into an international movement of gay spirituality and consciousness. And Harry, for the 70s, I first made contact with Harry in 1969 at a Gay Liberation Front meeting, and then he and John moved to New Mexico. But we kept in contact. Whenever Harry would come to Los Angeles, we always carved out a big chunk of time together to talk about gay liberation and what was happening. Whenever I would get into that part of the country, I always made sure I got a day or two at San Juan Pueblo to hang out with Harry and John, but it was primarily Harry that I went to visit. And was responsible for bringing Harry and John back to Los Angeles. They left in 1968 and came back in the spring of 1979. Because I'd been out there in 1978, and I was shocked by the poverty that I saw that they were living in. Somebody of his historical importance and living, and finally through manipulation, any other skill I could use, they agreed to come back to Los Angeles, and we lived together in a commune, and it was the beginning of a renaissance in Harry's life, with documentary films being made about him, a biography being written, his Radical Fairy work, etc. So from 1969 to 1982, we lived together for 3 years at the Radical Fairy Sanctuary. Soon after the first Radical Fairy gathering, I began to see that the Radical Fairies were coming like, an alter ego to Harry. It was his identity in a way that was what felt to me like it was cutting off some unwritten agreement that we had made, that this was about exploring gay conscience, exploring dimensions of being gay that maybe hadn't been explored before. And so I was getting a little frustrated in terms of how things were going. And while I was helpful and supportive and what have you internally, it felt like it was going somewhere where I just didn't want to go. Not because it wasn't interesting, but because it wasn't soulful enough. It wasn't deep enough. It was too much peanut butter and jelly and not enough caviar for me. And I was struggling with this. And James and Joe came to visit for a weekend. And you know what? Things were very busy and charming, what have you. And I got up early on a Sunday morning so I could go out and sit on the porch, which I love to do, and read the Sunday newspaper and just have some quiet time. And I'm out in the porch, maybe there's a 6:30 in the morning. And I'm out there for about 15 minutes. And who should come out on the porch but James? And he says, I was hoping I would find you alone. I wanted to get some time with you. I'm worried about you. And I said, you're worried about me? Why are you worried? He said, I don't know, there's something about this visit that I'm picking up an internal heaviness. There's something about that spirit of yours isn't dancing the way it usually dances. And I just wanted to see if there was anything going on that maybe could be helpful. And so I started to unload to James about what was going on, the struggles I was having, et cetera, et cetera. And he listened very carefully, as he always did with me. And at one point he said, you know, it really boils down to how many gurus can dance on the head of a needle. And when I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, that's exactly it. It's that two people with very strong personalities who have very strong ideas about things, experiences around things, came together to create something. But it doesn't necessarily mean they'll always be moving in the same direction. And then James started talking to me about the turning point in his life with marriage and divorce, et cetera, where he said at some point you just have to leave a relationship that is comfortable, that becomes something that it wasn't in the beginning, and move out in your own direction. And the more he talked, the more I could see that he was talking to my soul, he was talking to my heart. And it was not too long after that conversation where I explained to Harry that I felt like I needed some time to really go into the ocean and go as deep as I could go. And the Radical Fairy work and other organizing I was doing in the gay community was keeping me from going in that direction. And soon, while I kept one foot in community organizing, the other foot went into the ocean. And I spent around 13 years in depthful, very creative, Jungian psychotherapy. Began to listen to my dreams and then start talking to my dreams, and began formally studying shamanism with one of the best shamanic teachers in the world. And it took me in a direction that I needed to go. And it was James saying to me, how many gurus can dance on the head of a needle? That was the turning point in that. It was that conversation with James. And he didn't say more than maybe 200 words that morning. But the 200 words that he said to me was what I needed to hear at that time. And it was coming from somebody that I admired and trusted, and that I knew had walked his own path, that I could believe in the words that he was saying to me. And so it was one of the turning points in my life. It isn't that I left my work in the gay community, because I always continued doing it during the 13 years, but I deepened it in a way that I couldn't deepen if I had stayed connected the way I was connected then to the Radical Faeries. This is not a criticism of Harry. This is not a criticism of the Radical Faeries. It's a statement about how that spiritual path unfolded for me. And I'm as involved with the Radical Faeries today as I was ever. We're now planning a 30th anniversary Western Regional Radical Faerie Gathering in California in October, and so the work continues. But there was a point when I had to have the courage to say, there's something else I need to be doing. My soul is calling me in another direction. Even though I didn't know exactly those words, I couldn't articulate it the way I'm articulating it now. But I had the feeling inside that that's what I needed to do. And James was central to that. I see him working at the edge of the village like an old shaman. He knows what herbs, what ingredients this person is needing in terms of these work with them. I don't know whether that was conscious or unconscious. It really doesn't matter. He did the work, and he reached me, and there are many gay men who tell me stories like this. Donald Ham, who passed away about 10 years ago, often talked about his first poetry reading that he had with James, where there was this rush of love that came over him, and it was the turning point in him coming out. Donald Ham was a film director, writer, did a lot of programs for public television. And it was hearing James at a poetry reading and experienced James, which was the turning point for him. And I think he affected many people that way. What is the significance of the combination of sex and spirit? Well, first of all, there's never been a disconnect from sex and spirit. It's our heads many times, and those religious traditions of which we come from many times, that make those artificial distinctions. It's like separating body, mind, and spirit. Huh? How do you do that? You can't do that. Those are just devices we use for talking. Unfortunately, some people take it a little more seriously than others. So the idea that spirituality and sex are separate is something that comes into Western culture largely with Christianity. Judaism isn't quite that fragmented spiritually when it comes to sex, body, and spirit. Many times Jewish people are referred to as people of the body. They are very embodied in the world in a way that many times Christians and Muslims are not. But you find it largely, the division is largely with Christianity, although sometimes in Judaism. One of the places where James reminds me of Allen Ginsberg, or reminds me of Walt Whitman, is his refusal to go along with that line of thinking. His refusal to see spirit as something that he does on Sundays, and the body or sex is something that he does Monday through Saturday, metaphorically speaking. That there is a profound union. There's no way you can divide them. That the way we manifest our love, our caring, one of the ways is through sex. Sometimes, with me, it's just been pure lust. At 3 a.m. in some dark alley in Los Angeles, Unfortunately, that doesn't happen as often these days as they did when I was in my late 20s, early 30s. But there was some place where that experience brought out the wildness in me, where my soul needed those experiences, those wild experiences. And they took the form of sexual experiences, but much more than sex was going on there. Many times with the young gay men that I work with these days, especially since 1980-81 with the HIV precautions, there's someplace where I see that they have not been able to access the wildness of themselves as gay men, that animal lust as gay men. And I think that there's some place in us that needs those kinds of experiences. Every day, I hope not, but like the Dionysian rituals, ceremonies of ancient Greece, there would be 2 major Dionysian ceremonies, there would be 2 minor ones, 4 a year. And during that time, you could walk down dark alleys at 3 a.m., and it was seen as part of one's spiritual work. We have lost that understanding in Western culture. And I think gay liberation is helping to bring that back, along with feminism and other things. Reading much of the writings of, let's say, feminists during the 70s, early 80s, there was that reconnection of spirit and body. I'm thinking primarily of Susan Griffith, for example, in her writing. That there's some place where they were never separated. They're never separated in us, and that's why those struggles take place, because these artificial divisions are made, which naturally don't happen. And so James was really ecstatically open about that one finds one way, one helps to connect those separate parts of oneself through that understanding of spirit and sex are not separate. I can remember with the early work that I did in the gay community in Los Angeles, where I would talk about gay spirituality. And you could see in gay men's eyes, you could see something not computing in their brains. The idea that you would use gay and spirituality in one breath simply didn't make sense to them, because they were never seen as a unity, as being together. And James lubricated, and I use that word carefully, James lubricated that opening for us in a way that I don't think anybody other than Ginsberg and Whitman did to such a large scale. That there is no division between body, spirit, sex. There is no division. Those are artificial. They're like lines drawn on a map. It's like imperialists dividing Africa. I'll take it, and that's what happened. That our bodies became colonized in ways. And one country had one part, and another country had another part, and we really felt that in our lives. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. And James articulated that as well as anybody I know today. You know, with each generation, it's hard to predict what's going to speak to them. My generation, Allen Ginsberg, the first time I heard how, I lived on a farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I rushed off to Franklin and Marshall College to find that book. I was sure that a college library had it, and after a little interrogation by the librarian, I was able to read a copy. But it was someplace into my generation where that poem spoke, where certain works speak to one generation that doesn't speak to another generation. What's important, I think, is the communication between those generations, because there's a profound interdependency between generations, between youth, adults, elders, and ancestors. And there's the danger of living in a world where there's age apartheid. And that age apartheid robs us of something. It robs, if I didn't have contact with young people, there's music that I wouldn't be exposed to. There's poetry I wouldn't be exposed to. There are words I wouldn't be exposed to. There are, and there's a limit to this, YouTube videos I wouldn't be exposed to. By the same token, they might not be exposed to James Broughton. Or they might not be exposed to Carl Jung. Or they might not be exposed to Harry Hay. Or things that I think they need for their survival packet on this planet. And so there's a profound interdependency, knowing that there's some things that young people will know, and there's some things that old people will know, which are not about sharing with other generations, because you can hardly share them. But there are things that are essential to our survival that depends on that interdependency and that sharing across generations. And I think James's poetry is one of those. James's way of seeing the world. Because there are young people out there who need to know that, who need to know that there are other people who see the world as they see it. There's some place where we need to be blessed in a certain way. And it's not what happens on Sunday mornings in the church, where everybody is blessed. It's some place where our soul needs to be seen. I think James's poetry does that. Does it do it for everybody? No, I doubt it. Does it do it for some people? Yes, those who need to have it. There was an old understanding that it was the young person who always selected the elder, not the other way around. Because the young person had a sense of what they needed. A young person had a sense of where they were going. And so they could see in the village or the tribe the person that best manifested that. And then they would go hang around that person traditionally. Many times you'd have to buy a gift and give it to the elder. And if they accepted your gift, it meant, I'm taking you on as a project in the way somebody once took me on as a project. And that only happens across age lines. It doesn't happen, it can't happen if there's age apartheid. And our society and our communities are robbed, are impoverished by not having that cross-generational dialogue, that cross-generational support. And it's both ways. I am robbed, I am impoverished by not having the ideas and the spirit of adults and youth in my life. Do not ask where we go from here. Nobody knows. Some think they do, but nobody really knows anything about anything. We are only gurgles in the stream, and the stream doesn't know where it is going either. It is just going. It is just going with its nature as far as that will take it. And with its nature, it has to take along a horde of gurgles who are forever asking where they are gurgling to. Everything is going beautifully nowhere. I mean, it's so profound. It's like a Zen moment. It's like the young monk in the monastery who came to the Roshi who was dying and said, before you die, you must tell me wisdom. And the old Roshi opened one eye and kind of tiredly looked at the young man and said, when you're hungry, eat. When you're tired, sleep. And this poem kind of has that quality to it, that simplicity of where are we going? It's the journey that's important, as is often said, not the destination. And once you get that understanding, it becomes a little easier. This is it. This is it. And I am it. And you are it. And so is that. And he is it. And she is it. And it is it. And that is that. Oh, it is this. And it is thus. And it is them. And it is us. And it is now. And here it is. And here we are. So this is it. That's all, folks. James Broughton is a light in our culture that is growing dimmer and dimmer and dimmer every day. And James brings a light into that culture that is profound, is whimsical, is fun, is a result of deep sea diving by him. And it's something that we need to nourish our souls, keep us awake, and continue dancing in the moonlight. James Broughton is the devil. 666. James Broughton is here to corrupt you. James Broughton. Big Mama. Big Daddy. Big Joy.